Hello everybody, welcome back to EngLang Pro's YouTube channel. My name is Tori and today we're going to talk about some linguistic theories. So this could be something very familiar to you or you haven't heard of this at all. That's completely fine. It's not specifically written out in the study design as something you need to know for Year 12. However, in the same way that I find linguistic quotes are very helpful in your essays to really establish expertise and show that you know what you're talking about because you have expert opinions back you up. I think that linguistic theories are similar to that and they're able to provide more insight and the fact that you've done your reading, you really know English language well, and you understand the social aspect of it. So the reason why I am kind of outlining these to you today is partially they come up in Year 11, at least I think Sapir Whorf and Grice's maxims definitely do come up in Year 11. And secondly, in your essays, particularly your Year 12 final essays actually, they say that you should discuss the essay topic in contemporary Australian society. And that is a little bit of a hint that your essay topics should be focused around language in society, and what better way to understand language in society than for social linguistic theories. Particularly the last one, social identity theory, is actually not a linguistic theory at all. However, supports our arguments in identity very, very well. Particularly every time you talk about in-group and out-group, that idea came from social identity theory. So super, super important that you are able to fully understand actually what you're arguing and why it's true or why you believe it's true. And these theories from experts are the best way to go about that, in my opinion. So this is almost a little bit of background information or support for you to really understand what you're writing about. But if you take it even further, you can name drop these in your essays. And I find that very similar to linguist quotes, supports you quite a lot. So without further ado, let's have a little bit of a look at three linguistic theories today. We're going to talk about the Sapir Whorf hypothesis, Grice's maxims, and the social identity theory, which, like I said, is more of a psychological theory. So we'll start off with Sapir Whorf, which is also known as linguistic relativity. It's quite an old theory, but basically Sapir and Whorf, they came together in 1929 and they came up with this idea that language not only describes our worldview, but also influences it. So the way that I understood this best in Year 11 was my teacher described it as your language that you've been taught is like your glasses that you see the world view in. So the same way that when you put on rose-colored glasses, you see the world in pink, this is the same concept that if you put on Sapir Whorf glasses, let's say like a different culture's language, suddenly because you can only express yourself in certain ways or you can express yourself in even more ways, that is reflecting your worldview. So think of it almost, you know, that shrimp that can see like hundreds of more colors than we can. It has a different worldview because of the way that it sees the world, which is literal biological, like more cones than rods and whatever. But Sapir Whorf says that language is like that. Language will affect how you see the world around you. So let's explain this a bit more with this article, Helpful Professor, which talks about how our thoughts are shaped by our native language and speakers of different languages therefore speak differently, think differently. That's the whole idea of this theory, the Sapir Whorf hypothesis. So, Whorf is not alive in 2021. I looked into it. It's a collection of his words that was published in 2021. That was very confusing. But Whorf says that every language is a vast pattern system different from others, which are culturally ordained in the forms and categories by which the personality not only communicates, but also analyzes nature, notices or neglects types of relationship and phenomena, channels his reasoning, and builds the house of his consciousness, which is a very fluffy and elegant way to say language determines worldview. So let's talk about some examples. Food, for example, if you have lots of ways to describe a certain food compared to not lots of ways, that kind of represents how much you care about something, for example. Color, it's kind of similar to my shrimp example. Gender, so this is a huge one actually. If you speak a European language or Germanic language, a different Germanic other than English, for example, German, you might notice that there are gendered nouns. So, for example, in German, a table and a chair are male, and a door is female, if I'm not mistaken. So the way in which this is ingrained from childhood, it determines how people who speak these languages see the world, if they see objects as a certain gender, which is interesting. And maybe, that kind of supports, if you've looked at gender constructs in language, or how just gender constructs in general, it's super interesting social feature again, that we have words like fireman, policeman, now being changed to police officer, firefighter, things like that. Think about how if you grew up seeing every inanimate object as more female, more male, or neutral, how that affects your worldview. Super interesting stuff. Perceptions of time, so tenses, categorization, politeness. Politeness is another thing. So, for example, in Japanese, you have different ways of speaking to people who are older than you, or you need to provide more politeness in certain ways. So that will affect your worldview in how you see people around you. Indigenous, so the Inuit people have 7 different words for snow. And if you think about it, maybe that reflects how they have a deeper understanding for snow, or their worldview. And, this could also be, it's a little bit of chicken and egg, this theory, because we don't know, is it because they are living in an area that has at least so much snow that they need to, be able to describe it more in depth than someone living in Australia. So it's interesting, and that's why it's a theory. We don't really have much proof in either way, but does language form our worldview? Does worldview form our language? There's definitely a little bit of an argument for both. Idioms, for example, that's a good way how something is intrinsically understood by someone in the same culture, same language, compared to another language. And slang as well. So again, as we read through this, and this is a very brief overview, I would really, really encourage you to go forth and have a bit more of an in-depth look at Sapir Whorf hypothesis. Super interesting one. The way that language shapes perception, this is something that you can definitely talk about in your essays. So you've got this link down below in this Notion document. So have a look at this, but yeah, again, go have a more in-depth bit of research for this, because I think it's really, really worth it. Let's take a brief moment to think about how Sapir Whorf hypothesis could be relevant in essays. So when we talk about Sapir Whorf hypothesis, we're talking about how important language is as a filter or rose-colored glasses through which we see the world. I think there have been essay prompts that directly talk about this, which is a bit tough if you haven't actually looked into this theory. But you could talk about Sapir Whorf in all of these. So, language use in Australia creates solidarity, but also division. This is not something that many students would think about straight off the bat, but language use in Australia is not only English. And so you could talk about ethnolex, you could talk about migrant, different languages. However, how does this create division between worldviews, according to Sapir Whorf? You go talk about how Australia is such a multicultural country. We have so many people come in from all over the world, how they use their languages, and how this describes their world, even though we're living in the same area, to be different. And you'd have to find some examples for Sapir Whorf, but it's such a niche idea that directly does talk about the topic, but isn't something that you'd think about straight off the bat, which is why these theories are so interesting. Next one, language is a powerful tool for constructing and challenging authority. So think about it in terms of how do authority figures use language to construct authority. in terms of, for example, euphemisms, doublespeak. This is all actually really connected to Sapir Whorf in terms of using euphemisms like, should we say, like collateral damage instead of innocent civilian deaths. Deaths. I don't know if there's two L's. I'm a horrible speller, guys. Whatever. Rather than innocent civilian deaths, is actually using Sapir Whorf to their advantage to create a more positive picture or worldview than what is true. So you don't need to just think about it in terms of different languages, but also different language full stop, as in language features or terms, lexemes, lexical choice. Then, globalization is both homogenizing and diversifying Australian English. And this is, pretty straight to the point. You could say that you could talk about how globalization, more worldview, basically, due to more exposure to different languages, according to Sapir Whorf hypothesis. And then just pop it in 1929 to look really smart. Bam! So these are all the reason why I think it's so great to have these theories in the back of your mind is because none of these examples are what you would have thought of first when you read these prompts. And so each time you think about it in terms of these theories, you become part of, like, you elevate yourself and you distance yourself from the other students who've written, the very basic first thing that you think about when you see these prompts. And suddenly the examiner is actually interested in what you have to say. So let's move on to Grice's maxim. So a maxim, or maxime, I don't know, is a noun. It's from the early 15th century, from an axiom, statement of a self-evident truth. Old French, maxima, from late Latin, maxima. So I don't know why I put that in. I just think etymology in English language is really interesting and important, and it actually helps you out a lot. When you know the etymology of a word, you understand it a lot easier. But basically, we're talking about a self-evident truth, and Grice, in particular, Paul Grice, he came up with these truths which describe how language works when it's successful communication. So cooperative principle. When you are trying to cooperatively talk to someone or communicate cooperatively, you will follow these rules or maxims. And these are 4 that he came up with, and they were originally descriptivist, if I'm not mistaken. So he was using them to describe how we use our cooperative principles to communicate well. But, we can also use these in terms of prescriptivist almost, where we can say, if you are to communicate well, you will follow these rules. So there are 4 of them. The maxim of quality, which is the actual content of what you're saying. Are you truthful? Maximum of quantity, which is don't talk too long or too short. Just say the exact amount of words that are necessary to communicate successfully. Maximum of relation, which is, are you talking about, for example, in an AC, are you talking about salient features? Are you speaking about only what is relevant? And 4, maximum of manner, which is to be clear, concise. Talk directly only as much as you need to, quantity, and use the most relevant words, relation, that are truthful, quality, and be concise, clear. Sounds a bit like an English examiner or something, but this is a effectivology. So just have a look, do some Google searching, have a look at these different articles. This one is about just kind of giving an overview of the maxims of conversation. So in his book, he outlined these, which is describing how we communicate when we want to be understood properly. And so he talks about how when we talk, it's not a succession of disconnected remarks and it wouldn't be rational. And he talks about what is rational for us to communicate clearly. So be informative in quantity. Make your contribution as informative as possible, as informative as is required, and not more. That's what quantity is about. Don't talk more or less than you need to. Yeah, so this is actually quite interesting. It's Grice's actual analogy for this one is, when you're assisting me to mend my car, I expect your contribution to be neither more nor less than is required. For example, I need 4 screws at a particular stage. I expect you to hand me 4 rather than 2 or 6. And that's the same with communication. Quality, be truthful. And this one's quite interesting because this will be very based upon what your actual intent is when you communicate. So for example, if we go back to the politicians, when they are trying to create authority, not always will their intent to be truthful. But basically, he says that you should not say what you think is false and don't say what you don't have evidence for, which I always say in my ACs, never say something is true when you write an AC without providing evidence from the text. So there you go. That's part of maxims of quality. Maxim of relation. So be relevant. Just say that if I am mixing ingredients for a cake, I do not expect it to be handed a good book or even an oven cloth, although this might be appropriate later. That's quite fun. But basically, he's providing these analogies and real-world examples beyond talking about how you can be cooperative. And that's what all these maxims are about, how to cooperate in your communication. Maxim of manner, be clear. So avoid obscure language. Avoid ambiguous language. Be brief and be orderly. Oh man, doesn't look like we have an example. But anyway, this guy is great. He talks about how you should talk if you want to talk well, which is nice. All right, moving on to... Oh, actually, no, let's go and talk about them in terms of application. So, language use in Australia creates solidarity, but also division. Pretty simple. We talk about how, when we use Grice's maxims, Grice's maxims, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, guys. This will create solidarity. But when we do not, we will communicate poorly and thus create division. Language is a powerful tool for constructing and challenging authority. So, according to Grice's maxims, there are ways in which we can communicate most clearly. And then you can talk about how similar to the first point about authority figures, how do authority / politicians misuse these maxims and why? And also, how do we challenge authority by using or misusing these? For example, or even not just challenging authority, but constructing authority and then misusing it. So, for example, using jargon in situations in which the audience is not professional, like for example, using medical jargon when you're talking to a friend, this will violate which maxim? The maxim of manner. Being concise, clear, and just actually communicating well. You could definitely talk about that. So I think, maybe it makes more sense like this. And then finally, globalization is both homogenizing and diversifying Australian English. Let's see. So Grice's maxims are about proper communicating well. So let's talk about how does use of Grice's maxims represent homogenizing Australian English each time different. So each time someone from a different culture or globalization leads to different people talking, each time we converge on the most collaborative communication, this results in a more homogeneous language. All right, good. Okay, so next one we're going to talk about, and the last one for today, is social identity theory, Tajfel and Turner, 1979. So I talked a lot about this one in my essays, and that's because I knew I was going to talk about an identity topic in my essay when I was going in. So usually there'll definitely be one, if not two, of the prompts will be about identity, so Unit 4 stuff. And this is where the whole in-group and out-group bias idea came from. So social identity theory by Tajfel and Turner, they came up with this idea that you categorize yourself in order to give you a sense of belonging, purpose, self-worth, and identity. And that's what we base all our slang and jargon paragraphs on, right? We talk about how slang and jargon represents or results in us becoming a part of a certain in-group. So social identification is particularly, so there's kind of three steps to the social identity theory. One is the categorization, and then we go through social identification, where we adopt the norms, behavior, values, including language and attitudes towards language from that group. And I've bolded this one because this is particularly relevant to our English language essays. And then social comparison, this is also actually quite relevant, is prejudice against out-groups and bias towards in-groups. So every time we talk about overt and covert prestige, that's very relevant to this social comparison. So I think this one is super, super relevant, and we actually inadvertently talk about it every time we talk about an identity anyway. So let's have a look at how we can apply these. So language use creates solidarity, but also division. This is kind of what we think about first when we read this prompt. And so social identity theory is a nice jumping off platform. So first of all, you could talk about social identity theory in terms of creating solidarity with slang, jargon, ethnolectal features, all these things that create an in-group. And then division is created through social comparison. Social comparison, an aspect of social identity theory by Tajfel and Turner. 1979, I want to say. So yeah, I've still got it from year 12. Then language is a powerful tool for constructing and challenging authority. How can we use this? So first of all, things like constructing authority. Again, you could talk about jargon, in-group language, right? And then challenging authority is also part of in-group, actually, is anti-authoritarian Australian in-group. So every time we talk about our laid-back identity, the fact that we don't really adhere to negative politeness towards our politicians because we're so anti-authoritarian, and we call them ScoMo and Albo instead of their full names, and all that stuff, that's anti-authoritarian Australian in-group language. So that's to do with our social identification as an anti-authoritarian group of people, and it's an in-group, and it's part of social identity theory. So each time you talk about this stuff, you're actually referencing this without using the term social identity theory, Tajfel and Turner, 1979. But every time you do actually put those names in, it provides the examiners with an understanding that you know what you're talking about. You haven't just learned this from every other essay you've written. You've actually read the theories behind it. Globalization is both homogenizing and diversifying. So globalization, we can talk about how the Americanization or Americanisms, blah, 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 of social media language, young people in particular, e-speak, blah, 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 in group beyond like Australia, beyond domestic Australian English or national Australian English. It becomes international. And so that's almost homogenizing English as a whole. And if you talk about more in terms of diversifying, particularly Australian English, so this one's a little bit iffy because it's more than just Australian English and you want to be careful to actually talk about the prompt. So let's talk about diversifying Australian English in particular. You get more exposure to outgroups when you have globalization. And if you did psychology, you'll know that the only way to truly get over prejudice and bias with outgroups is to actually collaborate with them. So the more exposure to outgroups you have with globalization, this will reduce that social comparison that creates prejudice and bias. I don't think there's a D. Yeah. Which is, again, the theory is to do with social identity theory with outgroup and social comparison, but globalization is actually creating less of that, or it's working towards the breakdown of that, and thus diversifying Australian English and breaking down that in-group, out-group dynamic. So I hope it's been helpful as a bit of an introduction to linguistic theories. Please read up on these. They're so interesting and helpful for your essays. Trust me, especially if you're in year 11 as well, this is a great time to really get down foundational knowledge and get a bit more philosophical about this, and really understand the social interaction behind language. And that's super important for your essays. So that's it for today. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.